Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Hello, everyone. How are you guys doing on this lovely Tuesday? Doing well? I know I've got a whole bunch of you. A whole bunch of you not talking, so that's perfectly fine. Hello to everyone in Discord. Hello to everyone on YouTube. Fair enough. Nice and quiet. Hope everyone's doing well. We are in Anti-Oedipus 4.2, page 304 is where I had us, unless anyone has a different time and different place. Let me go ahead and share my screen into the Discord. And we'll also make sure that I'm sharing it on screen for the YouTubes. Oh, Lord. It's going to be a long few weeks, everyone. Just as a thing, I know this is AO. I'm not going to be diving into a ton of political stuff. But the former head of the Social Security Administration came out and said, hey, by the way, everyone who's on Social Security should start saving their money as much as possible, because the whole thing probably has 30 to 90 days left. So if you, I don't believe this is exaggeration. If you have people in America that you care about who are related or involved, just give them a heads up that that is something that apparently is coming. So that's going to be a long few months. All the stuff that's happened, it's kind of the one that actually has me the most horrified by a wide margin. So, that's a thing. So, yes.
So I'm far from America, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not an American. But Social Security is like provide for elderly people and like
provides for anyone who's in need. So it's the last of, it's called a welfare program. It's not. People pay into it and then the benefits get paid out when someone's older, retired, or if they die, their benefits are paid out to their children almost immediately. So there's almost 3 million children that are on Social Security benefits receiving it because their dead parent. Overall, it's 74 million Americans are on it. And of those, I think it's like 90% are dependent on it. So that's great.
But Brooks, can I ask you this question before we begin?
Yeah.
If our elders, like, end up, like, I don't know,
dying,
like they died, right?
Yeah, they'll die,
and
there will be people that will die for this.
Yeah, but at the same time, the people who kind of, given that tombs cost a lot of money.
I don't know. The knock-on effects are going to be actually orders of magnitude beyond, I think, what imagination is going to allow. Because you're talking about $116 billion of money that goes to people who spend it immediately. That is simply not going to happen. Like, it's going to be a contraction across the entire globe if that actually happens. This is a big fucking deal. So it's scary. We'll get to that. I'm going to end up streaming at some point tonight. I'm going to do my best to stream, and we'll get through and sort of do a full breakdown of that. I'm going to try to keep it out of my mind today because today we are doing Anti-Oedipus, and I have promised this reading. We are, if you think about this, and Jack's here, which is good because Jack is one of the originals who was here for the first round of readings, actually one of the first readings too. Hey Jack, it's 2 to 3 weeks from now is the 5-year anniversary of our Anti-Oedipus reading.
Oh man, I mean,
5
years.
That's
just way of saying we're primitive, though, right?
We are old and primitive, and 5 years, dude, fucking crazy.
Yeah. How long
All
they've
right.
known each other too.
All right. So, Anti-Oedipus. Here's where we're at in AO. 4.2 is really about breaking down and getting to their core critique of psychoanalysis, psychiatry, and building a materialist psychiatry, as the book is so titled or subtitled. We've been making our way through, as they've talked about, aside from the entire book, but these last couple paragraphs have been about how the building of the space of representation within the family operates. So when you have parents, you have mom and dad, you have things that are symbolic to you. You have a mom, you have a dad. That word mom, that thing dad, what those positions that those people hold become something that is transferable, something that is analogous, something that is relatable, something that is sort of taking a place in how you begin to perceive things because they are a symbol. Your father means something more than just the guy named, in my son's case, Brooks, and in mom is Heather. Mom and dad mean something more than just that person, because that person is a complex living thing. The symbol is not. The symbol is a simplified global person. Psychoanalysis builds this. Myth and tragedy take advantage of this, and capitalism necessitates this. This is what we've been kind of getting into this last little bit, just to read the ending of the last bit. Psychoanalysis is the technique of application for which political economy is the axiomatic. In a word, psychoanalysis disengages the second pole in the very movement of capitalism, substituting the infinite subjective representation for the large determinate objective representations. We're going to be getting into exactly how that happens and what that is, but this is where we're at in the process. The schizoanalysis, the destructive task, all of these things that we're going to be getting into necessitates that we begin to understand these particulars and these elements and the way that this works within the psyche of the individual. So we're going to be getting to that. I'm going to be diving forward. If there's any questions, any comments, don't hesitate to type into any chat. We'll be making our way through so many things. But I hope everyone's well, and we are going to be doing this. Off we go. Consequently, the ambiguity of psychoanalysis in relation to myth or tragedy has the following explanation. Psychoanalysis undoes them as objective representations and discovers in them the figures of a subjective universal libido, but it reanimates them and promotes them as subjective representations that extend the mythic and tragic contents to infinity. Psychoanalysis does treat myth and tragedy, but it treats them as the dreams and fantasies of private man, homo familia, and in fact, dream and fantasy are to myth and tragedy as private property is to public property. What acts in myth and tragedy at the level of objective elements is therefore reappropriated and raised to a higher level by psychoanalysis, but as an unconscious dimension of subjective representation, myth as humanity's dream. What acts as an objective and public element, the earth, the despot, is now taken up again, but as the expression of a subjective and private reterritorialization. Oedipus is the fallen despot, banished, deterritorialized, but a reterritorialization is engineered, using the Oedipus complex conceived of as the daddy-mommy-me of today's everyman. Psychoanalysis and the Oedipus complex gather up all beliefs, all that has ever been believed by humanity, but only to raise it to the condition of a denial that preserves belief without believing in it. It's only a dream. The strictest piety today asks for nothing more. Whence this double impression that psychoanalysis is opposed to mythology, no less than to mythologists, but at the same time extends myth and tragedy to the dimensions of the subjective universal. If Oedipus himself has no complex, the Oedipus complex has no Oedipus, just as narcissism has no narcissist. They're quoting there someone who wrote a Freud on mythology. So they're just quoting a bit. Such is the ambivalence that traverses psychoanalysis, that extends beyond the specific problem of myth and tragedy. With one hand, psychoanalysis undoes the system of objective representations, myth and tragedy, for the benefit of the subjective essence conceived as desiring production, while on the other hand it reverses this production in a system of subjective representations, dream and fantasy, with myth and tragedy posited as their developments or projections. Images, nothing but images. What is left in the end is an intimate familial theater, the theater of private man, which is no longer either desiring production or objective representation. The unconscious as a stage, a whole theater, put in the place of production, a theater that disfigures this production, even more than tragedy and myth when reduced to their meager ancient resources. It's a lot in this section. There's a lot in this paragraph. Let's talk for a moment about global persons and private, like how they're discussing this. When we have myth, when we have these large scale stories, the no narcissist, no narcissism feels like such an ontologically dust statement. I can simplify fractions. So it's actually an interesting little point. Didier Anzieu says in Freud and Mythology. Freud grants myth no specificity. This is one of the points that have most seriously encumbered the subsequent relations between psychoanalysts and anthropologists. Freud undertakes a veritable leveling. The article on narcissism, an introduction, which constitutes an important step toward the revision of the theory of drives, contains no allusion to the myth of Narcissus. They're taking from myth. I mean, this is what this example is effectively what this paragraph is going on about. Psychoanalysis takes myth and through the use of analogy effectively, they say, no, this is what narcissism is. This is what Oedipalization is. And they take that story, which is this, it's a large, people know the story. It's a big story. And they're turning it into a thing that is about the individual, you, almost perspectivist from your position, privatizing the public myth in a way that is very particularized, because there is no narcissus. There's you, the narcissist. There's no Oedipus. There's you, the Oedipalized. The thing that it's doing is privatizing these public concepts, more or less. And they use the terms of de and reterritorialization here, which I do think work really nicely because it does have to do with private property, the layout of these things. And that's kind of where they open. Psychoanalysis undoes them as objective representations, discovers in them the figures of a subjective universal libido, but it reanimates them, promoting them to subjective representations that extend mythic and transit contents to infinity. There's this double play. This is the paralogism of application that they went over in chapter 2. We're going to be going over a lot, I think, in chapter 4-3. But this is kind of that play. So, as they say, psychoanalysis does treat myth and tragedy, but it treats them as dreams and fantasies of private man, homo familia. It's one of those things when we start talking about how psychoanalysis operates. It's treating my dreams, it's treating fantasies of the analysand, the person who goes to the analyst, the person who's seeking help. It's treating myth and tragedy, but it's treating them as that of the private man, not as a social creation or social existence or social investment. It's treating them as that person's personal internal demon, more or less. What acts in myth and tragedy at the level of objective elements is therefore reappropriated, raised to a higher level by psychoanalysis, but as an unconscious dimension of subjective representation. Myth becomes humanity's dream. The way that these things are played. We can relate to the story. There you go. We can relate to them. It's these elements, the story that we tell at large, it's kind of raised to a different place, because instead of just being, oh, I can relate to that story or that character or this thing, or it's kind of like that, it's raising them to this element inside of private man's existence as a dream, a fantasy, a play that is play acting inside of all of it, inside of the unconscious. And that thing that happens continually is retaken up inside of that, inside of the subjective, private reterritorialization of all of this. This is what they're getting at through here. That's how I would probably phrase it, generally speaking. Jack, it's been a while. I'm open. Jack, is that close enough to how you read this? It's been a while since we had you. I'm going to annoy you. I'm going to force you.
Well, I mean, I'll end up being the nuisance, right? Like that's.
Please.
I'm sure that's not much hasn't changed. Yeah, I guess I read it a little bit differently. You're focusing on global persons, which I think is important. I read this more in terms of not the first paralogism, but the third paralogism. And I read it that way because, well, for a few reasons, but the main one in this paragraph being the emphasis on subjectivity. So in that sense, like for me, I guess in that the first chunk of the paragraph, I think this gets a little bit clearer actually when they start explaining what they mean by the objective, what acts as an objective and public element, the earth, the despot, so two socii, right, is not taken up again, but is the expression of a subjective and private reterritorialization. And then they move to Oedipus, but they're talking about capital there, insofar as we're concerned with socii, right? And in that sense, for me, like as they're focusing on subjectivity, they're focusing on more directly the third paralogism, which is kind of funny because they don't. It's kind of in the backdrop of it all. It's not as explicit as one would like.
Well, yeah, this is fair. Because they're.
So let me add this. This might make
Go
the
for
point a little bit, at least what I'm taking from a little bit more obvious. So, like one way to understand subjectivity is the vicious circle they talk about, right? So you have territoriality upon the we'll say the body of the organs, to keep this simple, right? And upon that, right, you have gradients of intensity. And as this, so right, that's your place, right? Then you have the partial objects, right? And you have them in a placement among that territoriality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the subject that traverses that.
Yes.
Right. And so that's kind of the grounds of subjectivity and what subjectivity is doing, right? It's traversing those gradients in relation to the rest of the multiplicity, right? You take that and then you put it in a kind of relationship to myth. And I think that relationship to myth is really more what they're harping on here. But I would read it in tandem with what I just described in the third synthesis, right?
I think that's fair. I think that's fair. Let me try to rephrase a little bit. In the paragraph itself and in this particular little bit, to me, what they're going over is the shifting of global persons and the way that, because I think when you're talking about, and again, how we name and number these things, the paralogism of application versus the afterword. Usually the afterword is the fifth paralogism. I want to know which you mean by the fifth. Sorry, because we've been over this. Everyone numbers them differently.
Yeah, for me, fifth is when they talk about Oedipus and the whole virtual actual distinction.
So displacement.
No, I think displacement's.
We're not going over numbers because the numbers are almost irrelevant.
That's something to think about. Well.
No, that's fair. That's fair. Displacement is the shifting of libidinal investments into familial or Oedipal contexts.
Okay, I think you're sort of working along 5 with that.
Yeah. Okay. Good. That's kind of what I figured you were getting at. Again, everyone numbers them differently. It sucks. Well, it's a third in. It doesn't matter. Again, this is one of the millions of ways that that this book has been fucked up over time. By the way, thank you, Simone Perrin-Dumais. It's lovely. I do agree. Like I certainly don't disagree with what you're saying, because what's happening inside of this, they're bringing out Oedipus as a thing, and they're talking through here's how like psychoanalysis as a project operates within myth and stories that are given, these great myths and tragedies, and how they're made private. And really, to do that, I think you can make a very easy argument that all of the paralogisms are necessarily being engaged. Certainly the paralogism of application, to me, which is about the taking of the psychoanalytic concepts and distorting them in a way that arrests desiring production. It's clearly what they're getting at as well. Displacement, that of the shifting of libidinal investments, or the way libido might invest in something socially, being taken directly to familial or Oedipal contents and crushed into that. Like for sure, both of those are being done here. That's very fair.
Yeah, I think I see where you're coming from. And that's kind of why I'm focusing on the 3rd rather than the 5th, because for me it's more like that last bit about the complex versus. So if Oedipus himself has no complex, the Oedipus complex has no Oedipus, just as narcissism has no narcissus, right?
Yep.
There's a couple ways you can read that, but for me, in a sense, like I'm thinking of like the difference between like the Oedipus complex and, say, the Oedipus effect, right? So like simulation versus here would be the complex. So more directly, like
I can see that. So for me, it's right in the middle. What acts as an objective and public element? The earth, the despot, is now taken up again, but as the expression of a subjective, private reterritorialization. Oedipus is the fallen despot, now banished or deterritorialized, but reterritorialization is engineered using the Oedipus complex conceived of as the daddy-mommy me of today's everyman, of the private man.
Yeah, and that's the trick, right? Because like in terms of simulation, simulation shouldn't be belayed to a complex, right? Although at the same time, they're kind of saying there is no complex, so it's kind of a double entendre to the point.
Right.
But then that's the reterritorialization too, right? Like you don't, the misuse doesn't need the complex so much as it needs, it needs to, it kind of, to change how I guess the easy way to say it, right, would be to use the reality principle, right, to kind of take subjectivity and put it in terms of an ego. That's the really easy way, but I'm kind of eliding the larger part of the argument by saying that.
Well, and the larger part of kind of what they're getting at here, and I think, because again, you can break down a lot of this, a lot. To me, the thing they're driving at here in this paragraph, and they kind of open with it, is the ambiguity of psychoanalysis in relation to myth and tragedy has the following explanation. When we were talking in the previous paragraph, and they were talking about the nature of sort of psychoanalysis is the technique of application for which political economy is the axiomatic. Psychoanalysis disengages the second pole in the very movement of capitalism, which substitutes infinite subjective representation for the large determinate objective representations. It is in fact essential that the limit of the decoded flux of desire and production be doubly exercised, doubly displaced, once the position of immanent limits once by the position of imminent limits that capitalism does not cease to reproduce on an ever-expanding scale, and again by the marking of an interior limit reducing social reproduction to restricted familial reproduction. And so what's happening is basically the use of myth or tragedy follows almost these same rules. And this is the setup that they're going through. They're like, hey, this is what capitalism and how capitalism's operating on the person and the family. And myth is being done in the same way within psychoanalysis. They're kind of using it as a foil. It's at the end of the paragraph when they start saying, what is left in the end is an intimate familial theater of private man, no longer either desiring production or objective representation. We've moved outside of that. We don't have objective representation, which would be more the despotic space of representation where we use, interpretation to try to divine what the king or god meant by whatever words or whatever story. That's gone on the one side because we have the systems of objective representations, myth, tragedy, and the rest of this that was used under the despotic. That's been sort of eliminated and subsumed into the space of the person or the subject or the private man. But at the same time that this is done, we're also utilizing that to crush desiring production into those dreams and fantasies. And so we have dreams and fantasies and myths and tragedies, kind of the two expressions of the subject outwards, seeing everything everywhere as myth and tragedy, internally as dream and fantasy, the projections and the development of these elements. This is the shifting of the unconscious to a stage versus to one of interpretation, one of debt relations of the earth, or just desiring production itself. It shifts everything to this theater that's put in place of production, a theater disfiguring production more than tragedy or myth when reduced to meager ancient resources. That's kind of the play that I see them making here. Sorry for the long explanation. It's a lot. I know. I ramble. You're not shocked about that.
Known you long enough.
Yeah.
5 years, I hear. But
5 years. Someone told me that.
Bless their hearts. Yeah, I think what I'd add to that is, so I mean, the theater comes up a lot, right? But it's important to remember that theaters get utilized in all three socii, right? So there's the theater of cruelty in the earth, right? I think one thing I would add to that is, and this is an open question, like this is something to explore. But when they segment two socii versus the third socii, they're doing that in terms of objective versus subjective distinction, insofar as that's concerned with representation, which it basically means they're talking about the fourth paralogism, representation, repression, as it pertains to an objective versus subjective distinction, which I think is them boiling it down to, in the first two socii, the syntheses 1 and 2, respectively, are a means more important to the fourth paralogism, to representation. Whereas with capital, it's the third synthesis that takes the stage. Well, if you'll, takes a different stage, I suppose. Takes the stage.
Helps the third, I mean, I think actually the language I'm going to say is probably very good because it's less analogous. To say that third thing, that the creation of the subject, the consuming subject that takes the stage, I think is a very, very good way.
Yes, takes a different stage though.
Well, but that stage, but where the people see themselves as acting out on that stage, in that theater, in place of production. They see themselves interacting with these mythical elements or these dream elements or whatever it is, the fantasies, and they see themselves as bouncing around there rather than being produced by desiring production, or even, and then they're kind of saying it, like it, not even seeing themselves as tarrying with myths and tragedies in a great grand scale, like on a global scale, or oh my God, the tragedy of life, and thinking about it. No, it's my tragedy, my stage, my actors, my stuff. Stay away. Where's my stage manager? Kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think this is why, like, I mean, this isn't a kind of even-handed paragraph, right? They're both complimenting and kind of criticizing psychoanalysis to some degree. Because
Yes.
on one hand, psychoanalysis does kind of undo myth, right? but only at an objective level. At a subjective level, it reanimates or reinvests myth, right? Because when they say the double impression psychoanalysis is opposed to mythology, no less than a mythologist, that sounds kind of in line with DNG, but then they qualify it by saying it extends myth and tragedy to dimensions of the subjective universal. If Oedipus himself has no complex, the Oedipus complex has no Oedipus, right? So like the kind of general theme they're getting at there is that you no longer need the complex, like it's gotten rid of myth and it's brought it. I almost think it's brought it into the. I think it's the territory. I think they're gesturing at territoriality there, but I'll leave it there because I've said a lot.
Cool. These paragraphs get to be a lot. The ending of this, though, because it's worth, before we dive into the next bit, because this is the thing you hear Jack and I going back and forth on, is the thrust of, I mean, it's one of the big thrusts of the book, but certainly a major thrust of this this section, and it's going to be continuing for a bit. This is not a random little thing that is sort of here and then we're going to get through it. Don't worry. This is like, oh shit, we've got a ways to go, to say the least. We've got a ways to go before we're through it meaningfully.
I have a question. So what's about?
No, of course,
okay.
Please.
Okay. So the familiar relation, right? So psychoanalysis as early on, like hammering the point, right? Like Deleuze hammering the point about like familiarization and how there is some certain aspects of maybe the kind of the development, right? Development of the child is that like there's defamiliarization, right? Like and psychoanalysis focus on this familiarization, the parental thing, right? And there's a foreign element, right, or kind of a blind alley in terms of like defamiliar or the things that the child like kind of like rather than like the bosom of the family or the holy family as such, right? It's the kind of the process, or not the process, but like the way in which like some things are not doesn't relate to daddy and mommy, right? There's things that are kind of like defamiliarized, and psychoanalysis seems kind of mythifies, right, or symbolize, right, the familiar aspect of something that is pre-given, right, in terms of like the Oedipus, right? Even thinking a pre-Oedipus way of thinking is also an Oedipus way of thinking, right? In some way or another, right? We see
it's I would say think less of it as like an Oedipus way of thinking and more as, because again, even though the book is Anti-Oedipus and they're using Oedipus as this thing, they are describing the very nature of representation and thought, and they're using Oedipus to sort of get at it. That's why they use the phrases of like, what's left in the end is an intimate familial theater of private man, no longer design production and not even objective representation. Even though we play at, either one of those, what's left is we have a stage on which we see things playing out. We see ourselves reacting to these dreams or fantasies that is a stage, but the stage is built into us. It's not a story that's global, that's actually like, out there, or even one that, the handed down through generations, through which we have myth or tragedy or these other things sort of play out and we understand them in terms of a social grasp. We don't do that. It's internal. But it's not internal to the point of desiring production, which would be breaking all of these things apart and playing with them in a very different way and be much more generative. Instead, we see ourselves as playing with representation, tarrying with that in our imagination. And this thing that we're playing with kind of loses any, objective, we could say, reality, but also has nothing to do with desire either. So it puts us in a super fucked position.
It's kind of similar, I don't know, like it reminds me of what I post, right, to people if you're interested in Marx, right, especially in the Grundrisse, right, about that, like Marx said that, quote, all mythology overcomes and dominates and shapes the force of nature in imagination, and by imagination is therefore vanished with the advent of real mystery over them. What becomes a pharma alongside a printing house, square, Greek art presuppose Greek mythology, i.e. nature and the social forms already rework in an unconsciously artistic way by the popular imagination. And this is its material, not any mythology whatsoever, i.e. not an arbitrary choosing unconsciously artistic reworking of nature, here meaning everywhere objective, and hence including society, end quote, by Karl Marx, the Grundrisse, page 246. So that's interesting. I mean, from perspective of Deleuze, right?
Well, it's the way I'd phrase it, and because again, this is where we start getting into, and I think even as we were talking, and Grizzler, thank you for the super chat. As Jack and I were talking, and I started looking, I'm like, I think you could make an argument that all the paralogisms are in this because they're talking through the nature of representation, how it plays. The thing you're talking about here, when we start talking about the public, large-scale social stories that we claim as objective, the myth of Sisyphus, the myth of Oedipus, the myth of this, or the tragedy of this, whatever those things are, the reappropriation of them and as private expressions that, those stories are because everyone has that drive or that feeling in them or that character inside of them, whatever it may be, this idea that we are taking these historical contexts and making them universal claims about the private human psyche, which is wild. That this is what they do. And that's what they're saying here. But at the same time, they also are talking about sort of Oedipus, the fallen despot, banished, deterritorialized, but a reterritorialization engineered. This is where we start seeing the double bind play out inside of this, because the necessity of interpreting all desire through this, everything becomes daddy, mommy, me. Everything becomes expressed in one of these tragic myths that is personal, but also internal. This framework seems or is played out as being a predetermined, as being placed there, as being universal to everyone, but a universal internally, not universal socially. And so by placing it internally, desire necessarily has to fit into that. And then when we have that shift made and everything kind of moves into that familial Oedipal context, that's this moment, the expression of a subjective and private reterritorialization. That's this moment where we're like, the social and political realms become purely familial. Everything becomes reduced to that because there's no longer this objective social space that we all share or we all know the stories, but there's also not the internal desiring production that is sort of pre-conscious. There's only my personal story, my personal relation to everything. I see things through my personal lens. And then
the global person, you mean? The global
person. No, we're not even there yet. This is just displacement, where it's the social and the political and everything has been shifted internally. This is just that displacement. So that objective or public element where we talk about things, the earth and the despot, when we talk about these myths, where these myths came from. These were stories told by people about the world and kind of, Aesop's fabling it up, or Aesop's fables more or less. But what we did is we took those Aesop's fables and we brought them internally. The stories are told almost as though it's like, yes, his drives are drives we all share. We all have these drives internal to us. We all have an Oedipus within us. It's now a subjective, private reterritorialization of these public shared things. That's displacement. Because ultimately we're talking about reducing these complex social formations of myth and everything else to this very simplistic personal relationship with mommy, daddy, me, and through that everything else. But then also the application of all of these elements. There's the line in here: psychoanalysis and the Oedipus complex gather up beliefs, all that has ever been believed by humanity, but only in order to raise in the condition of denial, it preserves belief without believing in it. This is this phrasing they've got, because they're saying psychoanalysis itself claims to explain everything, but explains nothing, because it's, again, and this is what you're talking about, reducing the phenomena to these predetermined categories, where the double bind, of course, is at play. And so, of course, then you end up with the afterword, which I think is the fifth paralogism by what Jack was saying, but Jack could disagree at any point. But this is the saying that it's a historical universal structure that's there, and the claiming so afterwards. The Oedipus complex has no Oedipus, just as narcissism has no narcissus. This is playing with the paradox of positioning a historically contingent figure, Oedipus or Narcissus. Like, these are historically contingent characters and figures, but we're placing them and positioning them as a universal structure, creating this weird fucked up anachronism that is basically saying that the thing preceded its own historical conditions. And so, like, all of the paralogisms are playing through all of this. Like, it's just all of these things. And that's that thing that happens, the neutralization of desire and its potential of change, its potential of shifting things and free and open, more open connections, all of that, desiring production as free, confined to determined family structures and private representations. Sorry for the ramble.
Yeah, but because it's kind of like it's similar to, like, at the end of the day, like, what Kant teaches us is that representations is a mere, like, function of thought, right?
Yep.
It's a mere, like, and it's a mere function of thought that doesn't, like, kind of doesn't represent the object as such, as it's like, as it's appear, like, as it's in itself, right? As it is, but as it appears, right? But like it, and like that's similar to kind of what Kant talked about in the paralogism, right?
Yes.
Not similar, but like the rational psychology, right? The kind of the Cartesians, where they're claiming metaphysically that I am a thinking substance, and like Kant said, like we cannot know that first, because the apprehension, the unity of apprehension is not it's a mere, faculty of thought, right? It doesn't represent like the thing in itself, right? Or the Ding ein sich, right? In itself. So I think it's interesting, kind of an interesting turnout, I guess.
Well, and it's the thing I think you see a lot today, because it's, when we're talking about these psychoanalytic concepts, one of the things that's difficult is a lot of people don't have like a shit ton of background in psychoanalysis. They're not actually analysts. Like, I know we have LJ and a handful of people here and on the server who do work in that space or play in that space or are a lot more familiar. But I think most people who are listening, who've come through here, they kind of go, oh, it's, like, I've heard of these things. We do this today, and you can kind of talk this through in how we make things private or personal versus how these elements are sort of these larger stories. When we say, like, Star Wars or superheroes or Luke Skywalker, the way that we work with them is it's not a story that someone told. It's not this, like, again, fable that we share. What happens within capital, what happens within the sort of nature of the space of representation, is we place ourselves in him, or we place I'm him on our stage. And he becomes sort of a way that we relate to the world is through him as a part of that stage, through that character as we see him. I'm always going to remember you, LJ. But it's like that thing when we shift these large social realities that are conditional and contingently determined and weird things, but we break them down incredibly simply. Tim Pool is my favorite example of this, where he's like, so you believe in utilitarianism? That's like when Thanos, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, that's the thing, is turning all of these elements into a play act instead of playing with things where they're at, which is their global socially determined characters in these stories, and desiring production connects to them as they do. We turn them into our own personal versions of these things. We turn them into ourselves. We find ourselves in them and we play with them that way. That setup is what we do with all of these things. And that's kind of, again, this is how representation works. We don't see, I don't know who your parents are. Like, this is how we get fucked up in the language. If I say, hey, mom and dad are having a tough time, the symbolic connection of it, what that means to you and how that plays and how that works is very different than anyone else, because it's particular to specific people. But the fact that they are global people, mom and dad, they have a very particular position that they are occupying. I am Brooke's dad to my son, Dexter. We have a particular relationship. We have a father-son relationship. That isn't a thing. Those are play acting. Those are representational categories. What Dexter and I have is a Brooks-Dexter relationship. That's not the same thing as a father-son relationship, but we personalize, we bring it in, we hold it, we take it, and we run with it, and we find ourselves relating to the world in these particularized ways. And that's what they're getting at. This is why all of the natures of the paralogisms are sort of necessary to really grasp all of this, because you end up, as they say, in the end with images, nothing but images. This intimate familial theater of private man, no longer desiring production or objective representation. It's such a good line. That would be my ramble there, I think.
I do think too, though, like, I would not emphasize that it's not the personal in my view, right? Like, it's not. This is usually how I phrase it, right? It's not an existential subject. Like, it's not getting at conscious determination or like a very inward determination in a general sense. I think it's more about, it's to see the subject as desiring production itself in relation to social production, which has it kind of its own subjectivity. But at tension with desiring production, right? Because the displacement is to displace the tension between the two regimes through the representation. That's your fourth paralogism. That's your displacement or representation repression.
Yes, I very much agree with this. Yes,
because
it's tough because in this paragraph is very much clearly making a point in one particular way, understanding how we turn these things to private man, we privatize and reterritorialize these elements in this particular way. But it is not making it personal. You're probably fair. It's a different use of language than I'm using. That's probably fair.
Yeah, subjectivity isn't necessarily the personal, right? Or it's not my inward familiarity. We can talk about how it conditions that, though. Like, that's more my view on it, because I think one of the most telling sentences is, so right, like, Oedipus doesn't need an Oedipus complex, right? Then they start to kind of walk out what they mean. Such is the ambivalence that traverses psychoanalysis, and that it extends beyond the specific problem of myth and tragedy. With one hand, psychoanalysis undoes the system of objective representations, namely myth and tragedy, for the benefit of the subjective essence conceived as desiring production. So, right, on one hand, psychoanalysis takes the subjective essence of desiring production out of myth and out of tragedy as objective representations. So, like, if you're thinking of, like, first two socii, right, like, we can talk about very shortly, like, how alliance is playing into that and how things of that nature are playing into that, right? But then they write, well, on the other hand, it reverses this production. So it reverses the production of trapping desiring production as a subjective essence within objective representation. It reverses that production in a system of subjective representations, namely dream and fantasy, with myth and tragedy posited as their developments or projections. And I think that last bit is the really both the key and the tricky part, because what they're kind of saying there is the subjective representations start to create the system, start to create the objective in a manner of speaking, right? The subjective one way to say that is the third synthesis becomes a means of kind of trapping the other two syntheses. It is one way to kind of think
well,
about
so for
that.
me, I really attach to when they talk about the double action of repression that they're talking about for desire, because it's doubly acting on desire. On the one side, we have the objective representation that gets brought internally. The thing that happens that fucks this up is that we are taking it as an objective global phenomenon and internalizing it. By privatizing it, we're basically forcing desire into or shackling desire, you might say, to these things. But it's also that as we are conceiving of it, we are also utilizing it as a personal, subjective element as well. Because it's not just that it's an objective thing we're taking internally. That happens under despotism. That's not just capital. That's not Oedipus. But it's that last bit where we also have this sort of malformed version of everything that sort of comes with it. And this is the double action. Someone in YouTube chat's mentioning, and I think it's a fair example. When we talk about, or people talk about, you could say astrology, tarot cards, all of these things. You go back to the original idea of astrology. This is like old Stoic shit. The goal for astrology was not necessarily to like create some way for us to divine the future, but instead it was to actually sort of sever causation from things. So I can share, I pull up a random card. This I Ching does this as well. I pull up a random thing, and that story, the example they give in YouTube chat, the lovers shows up. What it means has an objective social meaning. There's a story that's with that. But the way it's meant to be experienced, this is old astrology and I Ching, I am meant to take it in, digest it, and have it shift me. There's no like true meaning or what it is supposed to mean ultimately to everyone. It's meant to be a subjective sort of taking in of this objective element. Where we get fucked up and where it sort of gets a little broken is, and you see this today with how people talk about all of, tarot and astrology, is that they're taking that objective meaning and bringing it in and making it an objective global reality internally. So they're actually making it, they're doing that weird thing where it's like, hey, there's this objective contingent story, this myth. And instead of going, oh, I can kind of relate to that, there you go. It's instead brought internally, and it's like, this must be my truth. And there's a difference there in how desire is integrated with that, I would say.
I would still disagree, because I don't think it's people doing it.
No, I'm probably overstating. I'm trying to state it simply.
Well, no. I think you raise a valid concern, though, because it's the problem of what do we mean by subjective? Do we mean subjective in the sense that I am concerned about how much I like avant-garde music versus how much Brooks may not like avant-garde music? Right? Is it my personal taste as a matter of someone else's personal taste? Or is it something else? And I think that's the hard thing with the subject.
If I may, because I want to join that. To me, it's it's pick a movie that you think is good. Do you believe it is objectively good or subjectively good? Now, we all have this conversation. There's a reality in how we experience anything where we go, well, this is good. And I go, yeah, I didn't like it. It feels like, well, wait. Is that subjective or objective? Is Brooks saying it's objectively bad? Am I saying it's objectively good? And people take this quite personally. They take people feel the force of like, oh shit, he doesn't, I must argue. And the stupid internet nerd fights begin. But that thing, that interaction with desiring production and representation and these universal elements, this is that thing at play. The idea of, oh yeah, it was a good movie. I didn't think it was good. That thing that's interplaying there is how the universal is being made personal. It's how it's being sort of pushed into that position. So that way, when you say it's good, or you like it's a good movie, you're saying it is deeply subjective, but you're saying it in a way that as you say it, you're even saying it objectively. And this is where how I'm reading what they're doing with Oedipus, where it's, look, the Oedipus complex is Oedipus, these images, the relationships, all this stuff, as you're experiencing it, as the subject is experiencing it, and as they're produced to experience it this way, they're seeing these things and experiencing them as a stage, as objective totalities and global persons, even though the desiring production is being the thing that's sort of malformed, and then the social production after that's being completely dismissed and crushed, and everything's sort of being ruined by it. They're still seeing this thing as this objective, subjective, weird double play. And it's that double play that they say is required, as I read it.
And I follow where you're coming from there. But that's what I'm disagreeing with, that it's not the subjectivity of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Although I'm sure you would agree Madame Web is underrated.
I think it's a wonderful film.
Yes, it doesn't get the props it deserves. Tragedy.
No, I'm not saying beauty is in the eye of the beholder either. What I'm saying
is... no, I'm oversimplifying, but I mean the idea of subjectivity is a matter of like my personal taste. I think Deleuze and Guattari aren't interested in defining subjectivity that way, or like if I want to pick on existentialism, right? Like
I do think they do, though. What is philosophy ends with their discussion about opinion and how opinion is built out of the interaction of these elements in the brain, and opinion is that thing, right?
But through the three planes, right? It's a matter of
right, but opinion is taste, effectively.
I mean, well, hold on. Let's stick with this point, though.
All right, fair. We'll stay here.
Counter.
I miss chatting, you fucker. You need to join these calls more often.
I'm too busy watching Madame Web. Yeah, it never disappoints. Anyways, yeah, I would counter that though, because I don't think it's the subjective of. So like if I was going to pick on Sartre, right, to make a point. In Transcendence of the Ego, right? He's talking about subjectivity through consciousness, right? And he's trying to explain that as it pertains to the ego, as that can be broken down to the I and me, right? He's talking about consciousness. He's talking about experience very directly, transcendental experience, he calls it. I think that's different than what Deleuze and Guattari are talking about with the subjectivity, though. Because for them, the subject, and I've said this a few times, it's a group subject. It is desiring production. So it's not me looking outward at the images. It's desiring production as it's moving through subjectivity, where it's consuming things and it's being confronted with social production's use of images, so that kind of like... say like a capitalist subject in that sense is being poised counter desiring production subjectivity, because that tension, that's what gets displaced onto these representations they're talking about. It's a different way of thinking.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I think in this paragraph I think I think you're ultimately, in the terms of the book, I certainly don't disagree. I think in terms of the way that they're speaking in this paragraph, though, to get through it, when we're talking about this, it's important that we do talk about it because they're critiquing psychoanalysis. And so they're utilizing terms from the position of psychoanalytic thought. And so I think doing so alongside that doesn't hurt. I think what you're saying is completely fair, though. It's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because we're used to like the existential subject. But I'll yield the floor.
Quick
Go for it,
question,
LJ.
Jack. What exactly that you are not
What am I not?
Brooks, like in this paragraph? What?
We're not at odds. We're having one of the most weirdly nuanced conversations that we could possibly have about this fucking paragraph.
Yeah, and what exactly is like? What is the slightly different? Like, because Jack says he disagrees. I'm getting lost on what.
Allow me to try. The way I've been describing it, because I'm trying to come at it from a position of sort of describing a more open-ended way. The way that they're going through this paragraph. But I am making missteps as I do, where I talk about the subject or you or a person or the personal experience of a person seeing something and how they look at the world. And that is not D&G language. That is outside of what really they mean to say. I'm trying to do it in terms of being explanatory. And it's probably a mistake on my part, because what Jack is saying is that their ultimate point is that subjectivity sits in a different place and interacts differently than all this stuff. I'm talking about the language in the paragraph. So that's the nuance. It's not significant. It's just, it ends up being, when it comes to understanding and grasping the entire concepts of the book. Is that fair, Jack?
I mean, yeah, it's kind of the difference between like, it's kind of like how post-structuralism understands a subject versus like what they're kind of in some ways reacting to is the existential subject. Like Foucault talks about this, right? One of his criticisms of Sartre, and it bears relevance in this discussion. One of the criticisms he gives is, right, for Sartre, there's a way of understanding subjectivity by which it's kind of unconditioned by the social because it's so personal. But the problem with that is now you've kind of taken it out of the social. It's kind of the joke about, existentialists say, well, I can be free in my mind. And you're like, well, that's great. What are you going to do the rest of the other 24 hours, to be humorous about it, of course.
Does this kind of compare to another question? Like, if you are in a lonely island that's only of yourself for the rest of your life, are you going to be happy if you do something or if you become something? Is that along the same train of thoughts?
Well, no, because Sartre still recognizes we're in social conditions. He just thinks that like he's more concerned with how you as an individual can use that individuality to kind of overcome them, right?
Okay.
So it's not that you're on an island; it's that it's quite the contrary. That would be more like a solipsism or like a radical egoism.
And specifically, just to add to this real quick, where this matters, because I want to kind of pull back a little bit, and I'm just going to quote Eugene Holland. We are still pious or paranoid as long as we believe in any univocal meaning or representation, given that contemporary society, based as it is in axiomatization, operates beneath or beyond representation altogether. You can believe you are guilty of wanting to kill your father, sleep with your mother. You can believe in Oedipus, but you can also believe you are guilty of not working hard enough, owing too much, overindulging yourself. You can believe in the superiority of your religion, your nation, your sports team, your race. All of these beliefs are paranoid molar investments, which contravene molecular investments of desiring production. Psychoanalysis did not invent Oedipus, but in circumstances where widespread decoding undermines its means of reproduction in the nuclear family, psychoanalysis nevertheless fills the following function: causing beliefs to survive even after repudiation, causing those who no longer believe in anything to continue believing, even if it is only in their private, metaphorical Oedipus. This is I really love that set. That's about literally these 3 or 4 paragraphs that he's going over. It's page 304, 307 that he's going over when he writes this, because this is that weird thing, this privatized piety for an otherwise thoroughly cynical age. Psychoanalysis, to continue reading him, appears in this light as a subjective recoding of an otherwise decoded and outmoded objective schema of representation, but is no less virulent a repressing representation for it. Lacanian structural psychoanalysis only abstracts and attenuates the same belief without believing as the family, as social institutions succumb to decoding and deterritorialization. For even reducing or expanding Oedipus from family romance to linguistic metaphor, Deleuze and Guattari insist that this, quote, affords us no means for escaping familialism, but instead attributes a universal metaphoric value to the family at the very moment it has lost its objective literal values. And that's the social value of the family is part of this. This is the global idea of the family, what the family is, how these things mean, what these things set up, and how they sort of do this. The family, which was how we literally reproduced the nature of who we married, how we married, was part and parcel of the social experience. But now the family is deeply privatized, alienated. We are privatized and alienated. This is capital has built this, has sort of put this in place. And so the sort of trick that's being played, that's being put in, the schema of representation of how one perceives the world, is it's not really how one perceives the world. It's belief finding belief. It's the axiomatization of everything as everything's sort of broken down and internalized. As the myth goes away, yet belief in the myth is as strong as ever somehow. And that thing is the interplay they're talking about, if that makes sense. Jack?
The tricky thing is, like, you and I and Johnny down the road or whatever, we can believe in whatever we want to believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the unconscious does not believe. So, that's kind of the tricky thing, is it puts you in this position of what do they mean by belief? And, very generally speaking, right? Like, what they're talking about is...
social investments.
Well, yes, but looking
and
at
then the representational qualities internally of how we communicate them, because we utilize the same symbolic connections and metaphor in order to say what we believe in.
Well, to a point, I would say it's kind of like, when they talk about belief, I would say it's kind of like taking the grounds of those investments to be the transcendent itself, right? Like the grounds of the grounds is the transcendent. So it'd be like looking at the paralogisms as the necessary conditions for already necessary conditions, right? And it's kind of and if it sounds a little tautological, maybe that's even kind of the point, right? But
I want to get to the next paragraph, which continues this, I think.
Yeah, that works.
Unless anyone has any major objections, I'm going to start reading the next little bit. Myth, tragedy, dream, and fantasy, and myth and tragedy reinterpreted in terms of dream and fantasy, are the representative series that psychoanalysis substitutes for the line of production, social and desiring production, a theater series instead of a production series. But why, in fact, does representation, having become subjective representation, assume this theatrical form? There is a mysterious tie between psychoanalysis and the theater, as he says, quoting Freud. We are familiar with the eminently modern reply of certain recent authors. The theater elicits the finite structure of the infinite subjective representation. What is meant by elicit is very complex, since the structure can never present more than its own absence, or represent something not represented in the representation. But it is claimed that the theater's privilege is that of staging this metaphoric and metonymic causality that marks both the presence and the absence of the structures in its effects. While Andre Green expresses reservations about the adequacy of the structure, he does so only in the name of a theater necessary for the actualization of this structure, playing the role of revealer, a place by which the structure becomes visible. In her fine analysis of the phenomena of belief, Octave Menoni likewise uses the theater model to show how the denial of belief in fact implies a transformation of belief under the effect of a structure that the theater embodies or places on a stage. We should understand that representation, when it ceases to be objective, when it becomes subjective infinite, that is to say, imaginary, effectively loses all consistency, unless it is supported by a structure that determines the place and the function of the subject of representation, as well as the objects represented as images and the formal relations between them all. Symbolic, quotes, thus no longer designates the relation of representation to an objectivity as an element. It designates the ultimate elements of subjective representation, pure signifiers, pure non-represented representatives, whence the subjects, the objects, and their relationships all derive. In this way, the structure designates the unconscious of subjective representation. The series of this representation now presents itself. Imaginary, infinite, subjective representation, theatrical representation, structural representation. And precisely because the theater is thought to stage the latent structure as well as embody its elements and relations, it is in a position to reveal the universality of this structure, even in the objective representations that it salvages and reinterprets in terms of hidden representatives, their migrations, and variable relations. All former beliefs are gathered up and revived in the name of a structure of the unconscious. We are still pious. Everywhere, the great game of the symbolic signifier that is embodied in the signifieds of the imaginary. Oedipus as a universal metaphor. We're going to spend 2 weeks on this fucking paragraph.
He still hammered it down that the Oedipus complex is a metaphor, right? It's just a metaphor. But what kind of metaphor?
The language is going to get tough here. Is a metaphor? Oedipus is a mythological story that we utilize as a metaphor. It isn't a metaphor. How the Oedipus complex plays, and we are utilizing it, is the metaphorical metonymical structure that they're talking about. The structure, then, and this is why this paragraph is going to take forever. This is going to take a while. This paragraph is fucking a lot. Ask your question again. Let's do it.
Mm-hmm. Because early on, do you remember in chapter 1 and chapter 2, or chapter 1, right? He kind of used Oedipus as a metaphor, but it's what you said, like it's utilized as a metaphor, right? Not a metaphor in itself, right?
I'm hesitant to say that it is a metaphor. They're talking about it as a universal metaphor here. That's how they phrase it, because the way that all of this plays out, and it's how the paragraph ends. We're going to make our way through the beginning, but what they're sort of driving through is, as they make their way, everywhere the great game of the symbolic signifier that is embodied in the signifieds of the imaginary. They're talking about how, when I say dad, symbolically, I'm that kid's dad, that builds a natural structure, a network effect around it of how I relate and how I deal with other people necessarily. What it means to be a dad.
Relation. Familiar relations, right? Familiar. I guess that's the word, right?
Yes. I think that's a fair way to put it. Flat Score says, universal structure like a language. We are also targeting Lacan here. Oh, certainly they're targeting Lacan also here. Just to simplify, they don't disagree with Lacan. They just think Lacan essentially uncovered how the despotic and master signifier worked inside of the despotic regime, which was the second of the socii that they go through, and that under capitalism things work differently. We still have trappings and anachronisms from the old, but that's more or less their critique, is this is how it used to be, not how it is now, that kind of thing. Where do we start? Let's talk about series. Okay. Myth, tragedy, dream, and fantasy. And myth and tragedy reinterpreted in terms of dream and fantasy are the representative series that psychoanalysis substitutes for a line of production. The series, for Deleuze, this is a logic of sense reference also, but this is a thing that's very commonly used inside of semiotics, especially in France at the time. When we talk about the series, they mean literally like the order of things for the sake of what it makes. The representative series that psychoanalysis substitutes for the line of production. The series is myth and tragedy reinterpreted in terms of dream and fantasy. Myth, tragedy, dream, and fantasy. This order of things, the series that is being substituted for production. Desiring production has a series. It is the connective syntheses, the disjunctive, and the conjunctive syntheses. Desiring production works in that series. And it has its own sort of syllogisms and setup. This play that they're talking about, this is that series. The model is necessarily that of, for psychoanalysis, is necessarily that of the play, the theatrical elements, the interplay between them. The way that they're sort of talking about it is there is a mysterious tie between psychoanalysis and the theater. This is this thing that they're referring to that psychoanalysis has run with. It's Lacan utilizes the theater and plays. Zizek still does this. This is not unknown. We do this when we talk pop culture. We use film more than I think the theater these days, because I don't think people really go to theater that often, but they go to movie theater. They don't go to movies and TV and things like that. But they speak of it in terms of this type of series rather than that of production, rather than that of social and desiring production as a thing. I'm going to leave Shakespeare alone. It's all lovely, but no one goes to the theater anymore. And so that's that opening is them saying that psychoanalysis basically is transforming these or shifting from these concrete productive forces of desiring production to more this symbolic representational space. Then they start going into a theater series instead of production series. But why, in fact, does representation having become subjective representation assume this theatrical form? This is the question that they're going to be answering, and as they play, because what is this mysterious tie? What is this thing that seems to connect them? How do we find a way to make it work? How is this metaphorical connection operant? Right? I mean, they're opening with basically from the previous paragraph questions that we even had left over. And they answer. We are familiar with the eminently modern reply of certain authors. The theater elicits the finite structure of the infinite subjective representation. It's a way people weigh up their own ass about this, but this is how people talk about sort of film, theater, stories that are taken in this way. It is that the finite structure of the infinite subjective representation, the totality of truth, the way things work, blah, 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 blah. There's this sort of grand thing that they're playing with. This is how people see the theater. This is why they see this as sort of working back and forth, as I read it, at least.
Why do you call it subjective, Bruce? I mean, why do you call it infinite subjective? The infinite is what I'm asking about.
Let me see if I can find a way to rephrase that. That's going to take my brain a second.
I think they did mention
I'm looking through
terms together, yeah.
I'm looking through. They're very particular about it, and this is again, Holland gets into this, but I'm trying to avoid just, hey, let me just read Holland to you guys all day. So generally, we do consider, and I think it's safe to say that like subjective experience is spoken of as being limitless, unbounded, infinite. So the infinite possibilities that exist of what could ever be inside of the theater of the mind, the theater gives a concrete, specific sort of version of that. There is a particularized experience that theater is playing at that touches into it. So when they say the theater elicits the finite structure of the infinite subjective representation, I mean, this is their entire critique, more or less. This is the entire paragraph, so it's kind of hard. But what is happening in the theater and the things that are playing out is a little structure, tiny structure, like a finite structure of the infinite of what is possible in our minds, representationally. Infinite representation, there's a million possible representations. Think of all of the images of capital. Think of all of the images of capital, or all the interchangeable garbage stories that have taken place on stage, on screen, in books, in video games, on TV. The way that we can see, like all of those possible things that can be running through. But the theater, the story world, the structure of those stories, this finite structure of the infinite subjective representation is what is being elicited. So the structure, how these things can interact. It's not the representations themselves. This is the structure of such things. How a mom and a dad behave against each other. Specifically, let's just go with that. That's everywhere. And it's, mom and dad can have a billion versions of what they are, but there is a structure of the infinite subjective representational theater. There is a structure. And that's what the theater elicits. That's why the phrasing, what is meant by elicit is complex, since the structure can never present more than its own absence or represent something not represented in representation. The structure isn't actually in the representation. It's not actually like shown or like there. It's actually kind of at best the absence of the thing. Like it's structure's tough that way. If you've ever had to do a breakdown of a film or a story, finding the structure, the universal thing, the hero's journey, for example, fucking hate all that shit. These things that they play, this is the structure of everything. The representations, infinite.
The big brother, Faust, right? Faust,
say again?
Who's the big brother in, or Faust as a representation, right? The big brother in George Orwell, 1984, which is I don't advise you to read. But
I like Orwell. Orwell's pretty good. Orwell's not awful. Orwell's pretty good. But someone in YouTube, I think, says it really nice. And Ricoeur, which I'm not going to pronounce correctly, but that is the phonetic English version of how to say it, does have a great essay on this. I'm just going to take the point from Flat Scores. The point here is that the subjective element of fantasies and dreams are variable, but the structure is universal. The structure is objective. Actors may change. The theater remains. It's a fucking beautiful way of putting it, by the way. Because when we talk about like the infinite subjective representations, all the images that capital may be shooting through your brain are changing all the time. But the structure, that's reading between the lines more or less, but that is finite. And the theater's finite structure. The theater has a finite structure. It's particular. It's a medium and a message at once, almost. That's very much a thing. And so they say, that's why they have the line, since structure can never present more than its own absence or represent something not represented representation. But it is claimed that the theater's privilege is that of staging this metaphoric and metonymic causality that marks both the presence and the absence of the structures in its effects. The nature of how these stage plays work, we find the structure, the relations of everything, and sort of come away with it, of all of the infinite possible subjective versions. We take the structure and we place it to us or within our representation. We find how all of the things relate through that.
So when they talk about, Deleuze talks about structure, and that the subject, is he talking about the subject as defined by more than what Freud defines the subject? Because for Freud, the subject is the ego, right? And that's conditioned by the forces of the socii and the forces of the id. Is Deleuze saying that the subject for him is more than the ego as defined by Freud?
I'm going to say we're going to put a pin in that till later, because this isn't really talking about the subject. This is more talking about the nature of how we engage. I'm going to bring up Star Wars again. I hate doing this, but I'm going to do it. Star Wars: A New Hope, all the way through to episode 6, Return of the Jedi. We find out that Luke's dad is Darth Vader. Sorry, spoiler alert. It's been 44 years. Why is that a thing? In the story world, if you watch the films, people don't have parents. Like, that's not a thing. There's no parents. There's only one father-son relationship. And it's that one. People don't talk about their dads. They don't talk about their moms. They don't talk about what the relationships are inside of a galaxy far, far away a long, long time ago. Somehow, though, that structure, even though it's never said, it's never spoken of how a father should treat his son, or that these things matter, or that their relationship means anything, we immediately know, oh, fuck, that's his dad. That's a big deal. Because the structures, the images interplay however they do, but the structures that are at play are the things that sort of are the big part of this that we're taking with us. I hate bringing up Star Wars. It might be a terrible example, but that thing is fascinating to me. That thing is fascinating to me. Why do we, he saves his son because he's a father who truly, why? In what capacity have we ever learned anything where parents care about children, or that families exist as they do now? We literally have seen only the opposite. There's no nuclear family in Star Wars. It's not a thing. So it's this really odd, why is that structure there? Well, it's because this is the setup. This is how the theater is playing out. This is our presumption watching it, that this is our world. This is our symbolic order. This is the complexities of it. The things that are happening and the structures and relationships that are built, images can change all the time. They can have an extraordinary number of different setups there. And that's the Andre Green line. Andre Green, he does so only in the name of a theater necessary for the actualization of the structure, playing the role of revealer, a place by which structure becomes visible. He still sees it as the same thing, because the structure of how these stories are told, of within the stories, between things, how they're retold over and over, it's about him, for him, revealing it. That, like, great, I mean, that's still doing the same thing. You're still playing in the same way. This is why they talk about the unconscious as being a theater. The images you can have images and things flying through your theater, different actors and actresses and objects and whatever take the stage, but the structure seems to keep shit up. And why is that? And again, as someone on YouTube's reminding me, this is all repressive. This is the object of the critique, is this structure, is the structuration of these things that they're sort of playing here. We should understand, they say it here, we should understand that representation, when it ceases to be objective, when it becomes subjective infinite, these are the representation that's flying through all millions of images through your brain, that is to say imaginary, effectively loses all consistency unless it is supported by a structure that determines place and the functions of the subject of representation, as well as the objects represented as images and the formal relations between them all. When we talk of the process of the schiz, and they do often, the nature of how things are related to each other, how that comes to be, how we find meaning in the connection of different things, how these elements work together. The entire book's about that thing. And in Capital, and where we're at, the structure is set up by this mythological personal stage where images fly through, but the objects represented, but the relationships are sort of placed there. Symbolic, as they say, no longer designates the relation of representation to an objectivity as an element. This is a Platonic ideal type of symbolic. Oh, this is symbolically, this is that. This is designating the relation of representation to an objectivity as an element. No, not anymore. Now it designates the ultimate elements of subjective representation. Pure signifiers, empty positions, pure non-represented representatives, whence subjects, objects, and relationships derive. The empty position. This is one of the things, because Jack, sure, I'll mention it, always yelling at me about when we were doing our readings, every time we do one of these readings. And I'd talk about the despot and the king. And he'd go, it's not really the king, it's the position of the king. And that is the difference. That is 100% the difference we're talking about here. Because it's not so much that it's Henry VIII or this queen or this president. It's none of those things. It's not even Trump. Trump is almost himself an empty position of himself. I mean, in a lot of ways. But what's happening is that the ultimate elements of subjective representation, these pure signifiers, pure non-represented representatives, when subjects, objects, and relationships all derive, are created, are built from. They're built from.
So
Yes.
Brooks, in conclusion, one's no longer think about the theoretical subject as such, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't think about, like, we kind of, it's very hard to get out of the theoretical subject, right?
Well, but this is what I think Jack's getting at, is that line, because the subject is derived from this.
Mm.
You're derived, like the subjectivity you're proclaiming or acting on or believing in is derived from this empty, pure signifier. There's no symbol there anymore. It's this empty signifier. In this way, the structure designates the unconscious of subjective representation. The series of this representation now presents itself. And this is the series as it's produced. Imaginary infinite subjective representation, theatrical representation, and structural representation. This is the series through which we make sense, more or less. Actually, that probably would be literally how I'd phrase it. Precisely because the theater is thought to stage the latent structure, as well as embody its elements and relations. The theater is in a position to reveal the universality of the structure, even in the objective representations that it salvages and reinterprets in terms of hidden representations, migrations, and variable relations. All former beliefs are gathered up and revived in the name of a structure of the unconscious. We are still pious. Everywhere the great game of the symbolic signifier embodied in the signifieds of the imaginary, Oedipus as universal metaphor. That's the interplay. Someone asks in YouTube, would they be unreal considering our biology if we are advantaged by loving our families? Does the dream of mom and dad exist in the biological head? All of those categories or justifications or any of those things, they're just as unreal. That whatever, like, you go down your road, that's fine, but all of that stuff is like, it's the same stuff. It's just you've got the structure being laid out for you in the nature of these empty signifiers that are sort of predetermining and conditioning everything that comes out of it, including the subject, which is what you're claiming to be as you look back on it. This is basically the sort of process of all of that, more or less.
Can I ask? I know that we give you a lot of trouble, but does this overall critique match the partial object or the significance of the partial object, and what is the partial object, right? Not just the fantasy or imaginary fantasy, right? Like Melanie Klein, I don't know, Melanie Klein's professor for psychoanalysis, partial objects are not fantasies, right? Not imaginary, that are representations, right? In some sense.
So again, the way Klein used partial objects, I would probably say we may have an issue or two here, and I'll kind of get into that. But what happens here is that the partial objects are sort of pre-selected to fit into that. Again, the series is how he's laying it out here, and that's the important setup is we have the imaginary infinite subjective representation. This is the images, the imaginary, they're using images as in that infinite subjective representation, all of the potential things that could be on a stage, the theatrical representation, the structure of the stage, and then the structural representation. This is the series through which everything else comes. So partial objects, well, they are still absolutely what is ultimately being connected and produced, and desiring production is still going. The process here that has fallen back on it, that has begun to sort of fuck with it, we've kind of trapped desire in these positions as it's seeking positions, and it's looking for these signifiers. It's all of these things are sort of being played out, and the subject is being produced by them, determined by them, I think may even be better to say.
It look for the signifier that detached from the overall system of signifiers, right?
I think that's a fair way to put it.
Yeah. Thank you, Bruce.
All right, Jack, what do you got for me? How far am I off? Come on.
I guess the first thing I'd say is like, I just want to make sure it's clear too. Yeah, when we talk about like the despotic Socius, like I don't mean to say the Flying Dutchman must always have a captain. I mean to say that the empire itself is the plane, right? When they talk about the despotic, they mean something that is itself the Socius. That is not.
Yes, correct. I know. That was my point.
Oh, I know. I just want to make sure everybody is on the same page with that, because it's tricky, because we always want to think in terms of the title or the person, right? King Charles, or the monarchy by which, you have Lizzie or you have Charles. But it's something kind of underneath that, or something more fundamental in a way.
Yep.
But I mean, within the paragraph we're looking at, like, I think what's tricky is when they talk about theater, like I said in the last paragraph, they bounce around with that word. Sometimes they're talking about in terms of the third synthesis, especially in chapter 3. Sometimes they're talking about that in more general terms, like they are in some ways here. But I think just in that first bit, right, like, our representative series that psychoanalysis substitutes for the line of production, social and desiring production. A theater series instead of a production series. Like, this sounds like they're talking about theater here in terms of displacement, or the fourth paralogism, by which I would say they basically mean, instead of a series in terms of like the connective synthesis, where you just have kind of general chaining as grouping in an object sense or in a semiotic sense, right? In a signifying semiotic sense of that. You have that and its relationship between the two regimes, right? Two different regimes of that relationship. You have that displaced into what they're calling a theater series. And I think that's kind of the point of departure for this paragraph, because the theater series, the theater series is what the tension is displaced onto.
Correct. I have a conundrum. There is zero chance of getting through this next paragraph in 17 minutes. Zero chance, because this is Althusser, and that is not easy. And the nature of structuration, like, I'm going to have to bring in, like, this is a lot. There's
That's
a
fair.
lot in this.
Can we dwell on this paragraph a little bit longer?
Yeah, let's do that. We'll do another 10 or so on this paragraph. I've got a work thing to run to. Apologies, but yeah, we'll do that. That's perfect.
No need to apologize, man. You gotta.
I'm apologizing to everyone.
Enjoy your capital subjectivity,
Yeah.
as they say. Whether or not you have a work thing, you get to enjoy your capitalist subjectivity,
There we
right?
go.
That's the joys of the 9-to-5 life. But anyways, so they asked a question, right? Why, in fact, does representation, having become subjective representation, assume this theatrical form?
Mhm.
So I mean, notice what they're saying there, right? Representation doesn't have to be theatrical. And in fact, when representation becomes subjective, representation becomes theatrical. So I mean, again, to me, this sounds like maybe representation and the other two socii was using syntheses 1 and 2 as forms of objectivity, whereas now something like the theater of cruelty, it takes on a new, a whole new construction, basically, right? Because now it plays a role in representation. So, right, like subjectivity becomes the critical thing. We are familiar with it. So the theater elicits, modern replies claim the theater elicits the finite structure of the infinite subjective representation. So the theater calls forth the finite structure of the infinite subjective representation. So it's almost like the theater, according to their contemporaries, brings forth.
Well, it's the Menoni. The Menoni bit here, I think, is the, like, again, we have to go really deep in Andre Green or Menoni to really break this down. But specifically with Menoni, though, like the way that he wrote, one of the weird things about theater, and we can say the same of film or TV or anything else, is there is in itself the denial of belief. They phrase it here. If you don't know Menoni, it's tough. When you sit in a theater, you are suspending disbelief. That's what they're talking about. Menoni was the one who sort of really began to talk about the suspension of disbelief when one is immersed in a stage play specifically. And so it's not so much that we deny belief. Like in itself, we don't like abandon belief, throw it out the door, but instead that we transform it. We shift it because we are able to suspend disbelief, knowing we're watching something that's completely made up, but at the same time taking it in as if there was some reality to it. And so that's the denial of belief implies the transformation of belief. It's not that we just simply deny that we're watching theatrical. We're aware of it, but it's beyond that there is a structure instead that we put in place, a belief structure that transforms necessarily how we engage it. If you watch, it's one of those things that some people will talk about how they've seen a movie or a game and they won't even notice that they went through the whole thing in it took 5 hours, but they just were immersed the entire time so fucking deeply. This is the nature of immersion, and the nature of this setup and how we interplay is what Menoni's getting at here. That's why this contradictory position that they're talking about, the way that representation operates, the way that the theatrical operates, is interesting because it's not simply that a person seeing a theatrical play knows that it's fake. Of course they know it's fake, but it's more than that, because it's also that they are able to somehow find a new position to be in. This is a phenomenal thing for Menoni that I think is important here, because when we talk about belief and how belief operates, you have to remember that we're talking about the transformation of these elements and how they shift when a thing is, when we're taking in something, we're experiencing it, how that process works, how we're taking it, how we're structuring our relationship to it. The theatrical model, as they say here, shows this denial of belief actually implies a transformation under the effect of a structure that the theater embodies or places on stage. That's this thing, this weird simultaneous knowing they're doing fiction, but also taking it in as if it wasn't at the same time. Does that make sense?
I see where you're coming from. Hold on, let me back up here.
Okay.
Because the question in front of us at least at the second there is,
yep,
why does representation, having become subjective representation, so otherwise not needing to do this, take on the theatrical form, right?
Yes.
Why does subjective representation bring forth the theatrical form? And I think what's interesting is they say, like, their contemporaries say the theater brings forth the finite structure of the infinite subjective representation, which
yes,
what they're basically saying is the theater is there to give a terminating structure to a non-terminating subjective representation. But then they say illicit, and I think I see why they're doing this. They say illicit is a very complex idea because the structure.
I'm hesitant, just real quick, because to me it's the theatrical form, and they're very particular about this. The representations themselves don't really have like a symbolic structure. Not in the way like that, if I were to talk about Lacan, or I were to talk about Zizek, or anyone who plays in symbolic structuration, like the representation itself doesn't have that. The theater gives that. The theater is the structure that is being placed there. And that interaction, again, it's why I think they're talking about Andre Green, or they're talking about Metonymy here, is that the introduction of structure to representation, together, it's able to do this the entirety of this interaction.
But let's hold on though, because I don't think they're agreeing with their contemporaries here, or at least they're. I mean, it's not. If they are agreeing, it's not direct, because they say.
If I may, I don't think they're agreeing in the sense of like they're. Because like Menoni is believing that this is like baseline human behavior, or that it's prescriptive of it. I think they're saying Menoni's got something here. This is how we're fucked up. Like this is the problem.
I don't mean Menoni necessarily.
Okay.
Because they say the eminently modern reply of certain recent authors. They don't. I'm not sure who they're directing that at. They're just
That's
saying
a
our
good question.
contemporaries, right?
Yeah, it's fair.
So it's ambiguous. They're saying we're talking about people among us. We're just not going to tell you who they are. So it's classic DNG.
No shit.
But what they say is that our contemporaries say the theater brings forth the finite structure of the infinite subjective representation. And then what they say is, by illicit, this is a kind of complex idea because the structure can never present.
Sorry, it's probably Derrida. I just started Googling around a little bit. I think it's Derrida.
Oh, okay. What got me, but the structure can never present more than its own absence. So like right there, right, the structure doesn't. I mean, this is, and it might be Derrida because this is a pun, but the structure is never present except insofar as it's presenting its absence, right?
Yes.
So the structure works through its absence, or represents something not represented in the representation, meaning that which is represented must be something represented. So there's a relationship.
If I were to say this is in line with logic of sense, I would say this to me is almost like one for one when he's talking about the way we have the bodies or the ideas, and then at the surface we're able to like be in a different place. When he's talking about structure is something that is elicited. It's not, structure doesn't like show itself. Structure isn't the line on the ground, or it's not the people literally on the stage. It's not the photograph of it. Instead, the structure is elicited by the interactions of it, and it actually can only ever present its own absence. And a structure can't really show itself because it's not directly represented in representation. It's in the relations of them.
Well, I mean, that's the first part, right? Is so the structure is there through the theater brings forth the structure's absence, right? So that's the first point. The second point is or the theater represents something represents something not represented in the representation. It can never represent something not represented in the representation. So that which is in the representation is what is representable, right? So if we're working with series, right? A series is kind of like your collections of things you're going to work with.
Mm-hmm.
That which is represented is within the representation, right? And it's like it sounds a bit self-referential, but that's kind of their point, right? The representation works with what is representable. It doesn't work with what is not representable. So think of like what we've talked about in chapter 3, right? Think about like those examples with the Alliant, for instance. So that's the modern reply, right? What is then they say, but it is claimed that the theater's privilege is that of staging this metaphoric and metonymic causality that marks both the presence and the absence in its effects. So notice what they do here. They say there's these 2 points in the modern reply, but there's also this point where the modern reply claims the theater, it has the unique privilege of staging these causalities to mark both the presence and the absence of the structure in its effects. So the effects of the structure are marked by these other 2 things, supposedly. That's why I can't quite tell if they're just describing it here. I can't tell if they're fully agreeing or disagreeing. But then they say
they're critiquing, but they're going through, because what they're trying to do is really pull out specifically why consistently you find in psychoanalysis the idea of the theater and stories playing out in the imaginary. This is the language that Lacan uses. I think they're going specifically after that.
Only to a point, though, right? Because there's a twist here. The theater doesn't have to be the form of representation. It's only under subjective representation the theater takes this form. Right? That's the which, to your point, probably does get at like why would psychoanalysis may need this to do what psychoanalysis does, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it does get at what you're talking about, but kind of like from a step back. Well, Andre Green expresses reservations about the adequacy of the structure. So the structure may be inadequate. He does so only in the name of a theater necessary for the actualization of the structure.
Playing the role of revealer, a place by which the structure becomes visible. This is Andre Green. This is the footnote, just to say, because Andre Green is, as they're saying, like even Andre Green is like, the theater isn't like the best version of this, but hey, he's expressing reservations about the adequacy of the structure. He does so only in the name of a theater necessary for the actualization of the structure, kind of fucking with it. The quote they use. However, the criticism Green makes of the structure is not conducted in the name of production, but in the name of representation, invokes the necessity for extra structural factors that must do nothing more than reveal structure and reveal it as Oedipal. This is the,
well, it's the 5th paralogism, right? The structure kind of needs, his critique is the structure needs to be actualized. Which makes perfect sense if it's absent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're invested, like they're saying, in the representation as opposed to production, right?
Well, if the structuration is the point, then yeah. It's great for you. Like if the structuration is the point, which it is for them, and that's ultimately the frustration for them, for D&G, I think, is that the structuration is not the point. But it's part of that thing that is ultimately sustaining belief, despite belief no longer being there, ultimately. Like we no longer believe, but yet we believe kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of like saying we would almost prefer if Green would have just kind of, like, maybe we don't need the theater because we have production here, right? So we don't need this because what Green is doing is he's reinforcing the displacement. right? He's saying the displacement has a reservation because it still needs to be actualized, which at that point you go to the fifth paralogism, right? Actualization versus virtualization, for lack of a better word.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So they have some. It's a little even-handed what they're saying there.
Well, they're starting out open. Again, this is the beginning, and we'll probably revisit this next week when we start, because this is they're absolutely critiquing the idea of this structure and how this is set up, and they make that clear as we go through it. So just because it is someone in YouTube's like, make it clear. It's like, I want to be clear. They are being very critical of this, but they're starting from a position of, like, as they do, light. They're starting light, and they're going, hey, here's how Andre Green was even doubted it, but still played in that position. Metonymy did this, and this, and they're just going through and sort of laying out all the elements of how this structure operates, so they can ultimately, put a knife in its heart, which they intend to do over the next like 3-4 paragraphs. Because that's where they end up is ultimately sort of tearing it apart. I'm jumping ahead slightly, but I want to get to the Metonymy quote. In the final analysis, is indeed what is at issue, as Metonymy shows. How can belief continue after repudiation? How can we continue to be pious? This is the weird thing that happens in capital. We don't have belief in the same structure. We don't have belief in the same way or the same type of setup as we did before. How is belief able to be part of this? Yet we've repudiated, yet we're cynical, yet capital has done what it is. And this is where we get into Archie Bunker and all the other great little quotes. But this thing that's happening, how are we able to be there? And that's what they're trying to answer in this section through a critique. Well, I think is a fair way to put it.
But hold on, let's back up though, because the question is, why does the subjective representation use the theatrical form? Because it doesn't have to.
It doesn't have to. This is right? True.
That's the really interesting thing. This does not have to be the theater. And I suspect this is because subjectivity and social production makes use of theaters, and more generally speaking. But hold on though, because you jumped to the Metonymy bit.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is they say, so the theater model uses denial of belief to transform belief under the effect of a structure that theater embodies.
Denial is important. I'm hesitant to say denial because Metonymy doesn't like denial isn't a total toss out. It's not complete removal or blockage. Specifically, it's that it's transformed, and that it's far more complex for Metonymy. And so that's the thing is like the interaction that's happening is far more complex than just a denial of that belief. Instead, we're playing out a structuration that sort of creates and revives itself.
But I think that's their point though, right? The denial of belief creates a transformation of belief. And it does that by placing belief on the stage, if I follow this. So the structure provides a stage for which belief can be put upon. And by putting belief on a stage, belief can be denied, and in doing so, it's transformed. The question is, why is that important, though?
Well, because it has to do with where the investments are. Because the belief becomes sort of secondary to all of that. The belief isn't the thing, that it's far more complex than just simply belief. That instead this is about how emotionally invested people become in things and how that happens, and the framing and the structuration there. Because that is still what's happening in the theatrical sense, where we are watching a play. We're aware we're watching a play. And it's not that we just simply suspend disbelief, which is a common misunderstanding of what happens, that we're just like, oh, just disassociate from our bodies and like watch a play. No, there's more happening, and it has to do with sort of the way that we are invested in the elements of it and the emotional relationships that exist. And that's the thing I think that they're driving at least for me.
When you say belief, are you talking about belief in capitalism? The capitalism, in order to,
I think that's the thing, is no one believes in capitalism. That's the
right.
Like,
So Freud was doing us a favor by turning it into myth, fantasy, dreams, in order to make us believe that it's within ourselves, in order to finally accept capitalism by this by way of psychoanalysis. Is that true?
I would say not necessarily, though. But I think it's more belief in the sense of like, it's belief as though the unconscious would believe in the paralogisms.
I'm hesitant to agree with that. I'll go ahead. I've just got a thing after this.
Okay. I would simply say that it's like, because they've been very clear about this. The unconscious doesn't do belief, right? So it would be as though, it would be, to say it in like a kind of a Kantian way, I think their contention is that it would be like saying the conditions of immanent experience rely on transcendent conditions, right? And that's the thing that the unconscious doesn't believe in, is the transcendent conditions. On the contrary, those are misuses of the conditions of immanent experience. The immanent conditions of experience, excuse me.
So for psychoanalysis, for them, it's our mental life is vast, is formless, you could say. Theater creates a framing, a structure, limitations on space or time, where our internal experiences can be externalized in a structured way. So when we have the theatrical form and it's imposing limits, it's the finite structure on what would otherwise be an endless flow of representation, this infinite subjective representation. Psychoanalytic thought privileges it because it can, at the same time that it's showing the presence of structure, because something is being performed, it's showing the presence of it, it's also able to indicate the absence of structure through what isn't shown but is implied. And so that's the phrase they use, the metaphoric and metonymic causality, right? They use that phrase. It's because we specifically in theater, and this is true of, I would just say maybe theater is understating it, because I think it's a lot more art, but like when we have actors or dialogue or scenes, or even the angle of the camera on TV, how things are staged, all of this points to invisible structures that organize the experience we're having of the thing. It's making implicit things explicit. It's making unconscious things conscious, but within this defined frame in a way that has its own sort of plausible deniability. That's why psychoanalysis loves this. Like, and that's why it works really nicely for them, because it's, hey, here's Oedipus. And at the same time that it's the performance of Oedipus, where it's, Mom, I want to fuck Mom, I want to kill Dad, like that thing. This is you could say the explicit outward performance of it. There's elements of absence through what isn't there, but is implied through how a proper person should engage with Mom and Dad. Like, because it's got both of those. And again, this is the phrase they use the 2 paragraphs ago, where they're like, you need this double fuckery in order to get desire, trapped as it is. Because when you have Oedipus, it's like, oh, this is what Oedipus is. You want to fuck your mom and kill your dad. But it's not that simple, because the performance of it, as it's playing out in psychoanalysis, is not purely this, oh yes, that is the thing, even though that's the joke. What's happening is, in that thing, we have also the unperformed, or the structure that is presumed or inferred and implied through what isn't actually shown. And this is that metaphoric metonymic causality they're referring to, the visible pointing to invisible structures that organize experience. This is why this shit is so loved in psychoanalysis, I think.
So in that theater that's dramatized, the subjective representation, the subject is kind of has this kind of agency, right? as if it has this sense of agency, but it's purely determined by the structure.
So we're not at what they're going. There's a big caveat to my response. What I'm going to say is not what D&G's ultimately point is, because again, we're starting with the critique, but in psychoanalysis, they're saying within psychoanalysis, within this critique of how the theater works and how psychoanalysis plays and how we are fucked within capital, the agency is as much an agent of someone who's watching a play or seeing a thing play out, that the play that is happening has at the same time the explicit outward thing of the mom, dad, me, but also the implicit, which is the things that are not said but are implied through the way that it is performed or the angles or the setup. And the subject is made through this. And again, this is the Oedipus's universal metaphor, the great game of the symbolic signifier embodied in the signifieds. This is, I think, where their critique is centered around this.
I don't know. Psychoanalysis claimed that the theoretical subjects is already kind of abstract, but at the same time it affirmed the subjective representation of this theoretical subject as such, right? And it put it in contradiction with itself, right?
Well, this is, and again, they're stating what's happening within psychoanalysis and why psychoanalysis is so smitten with the idea of the theatric or the theatrical or the theater. And that's why they have the line, precisely because the theater is thought to stage the latent structure as well as embody its element and relations, it is in a position to reveal the universality of the structure, even in the objective representation that it salvages and reinterprets in terms of hidden representatives, their migrations and variable relations. Blah, blah, blah. Their critique is going to be, again, just sort of to fast forward because I kind of have to finish this, but their critique is going to be, hey, Marx said that you cannot tell how the wheat was grown by tasting bread. And yet psychoanalysis is going to sit here and say, well, here's how the stage is playing out, and therefore you can tell where everything comes out. It's like, no. The things that are coming out of it, the reinterpretations, the stories, the performances, all of these things that the theatrical is doing is, for psychoanalysis, revealing a universality of that underlying structure. But that isn't what it's doing. Theater is, for this, it is the structuration that is sort of being used in place. Man, this is a tough thing to fucking talk about.
It's kind of like the prolonged letter by Lacan, right? Where we find the structuration there, right? Already there in Edgar Allan Poe, right?
Because we're looking for it, but yes.
Exactly, the letter, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody don't know the writings.
The letter in plain sight, yes.
Yeah.
Still not quite sure though, because it's like when they say, well, I mean, I guess going back to this, right? I know you have to go, Brutz, but yeah, I mean, the thing that they seem to be kind of trying to understand is why does subjective representation use the theater as opposed to something else, and why, in a sense, does objective representation not use the theater?
Here's, I would say my answer would be simple. It can. I don't want to say it can't use the theater. I think the challenge is, and it's that the theater is the structure. That's the problem. That there is a structure. That's the critique I think they will be making, because that's, for psychoanalysis, there is a structure to how thought connects and how people are born, blah, 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 blah. Like, here's what you do, here's how you want, here's the relationships of everything. And it's played out, and even through the things that it's not inferring, there is a structure. And I don't think they're saying, because as they said elsewhere, Oedipus is a thing. They're not going to say that no one's ever got the Oedipus complex. There are fucking people of all shapes and sizes. So it's not so much that, but it's that that's a determined structure and that it's universal. And that's the challenge, I think, for them, is that they're like, the theater is not the structure. It might be, you might be that, you might do that thing. You do your jam, like that jam that's happening. I'm saying this quickly, sorry, because I have to go to the bathroom on top of having to run to work. But like that thing, I think is, that part makes sense to me, at least a little bit. Someone from YouTube says, we're getting stuck at the word objective here, but it's quite simple maybe. Objective refers to denotative element of representation, which gets to be secondary in the structure of the unconscious.
I don't think we're getting stuck on it. I think it's more...
I don't either.
Like, so I appreciate that that's being brought in. At the same time, like, I don't think we're getting stuck on, like, trying to see what's different between subjective and objective as terms. It's a matter of why subjective representation uses the theater, whereas objective representation wouldn't need to, right? And why subjective representation having access to things
the nature of the objective representational space would be under the despotic, because again, these elements are anachronistic; they're leftovers. Under the despotic, we would all be basically trying to figure out what did the king mean when he wrote this? What is this meaning? There is and going like, what does God mean when he says the word it? That kind of dumb shit. As we move into capital, which is where we're at flatly, psychoanalysis about capital, this is about capital. We're in the space of capital. The elements that are left over is that sort of demand towards that objectivity, the demand or the push towards that, the subjective elements that are needing to be controlled. This is what psychoanalysis is doing. To me, it's a question of, is this how psychoanalysis is able to constrain the basically unlimited flow of images that is just deterritorializing, decoding, fucking around, flying through everything that desire can connect. But the space where we start talking about the actual structure, this is how things work. This is blah, blah, blah. That thing, I think, is what we're leaning towards. And so it's not so much that the subjective necessitates, the subjective infinite representation necessitates the theater, but that the theater is utilized to repress that space and operates with it pretty well.
Is there also a way to deny the axiomatic of capitalism? I
mean, this is part of that.
Okay. So when he says a productive series, that refers to capital, right? To the capital investments.
Yes.
And
we're within the capitalist socius at this point fully. Like there's none of this is going to apply otherwise. They're going to refer to other things anachronistically, but that's why they say the phrase "we are still pious." Because piety is something that is a leftover from the despotic as they spoke of it and as the priests existed and blah, 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 like all that. We are still pious. It's a structure of the unconscious that's being revived, as they say.
Right. So instead of confronting capital axiomatics, like the Marxist perspective, Freud offers a way to avoid that, right? And to come around to accepting it. Would that be right?
Freud finds a way to marry all of it together underneath a structure that enables the full version of capitalist repression to play out. But that's a whole other discussion. And my brain's dying slowly. I'm going to close up. We are going to close up. That's a solid fucking 2 hours on 2 paragraphs. And next week, we're going to probably redo this paragraph and do again. As always, every Friday, noonish, I am going to have an open office. We're going to rediscuss this paragraph, and I'm just going to spend time going through all of the secondary texts, all of the comments made. I appreciate all of this. I appreciate everyone's input on this. These are fucking, if this was easy, people would understand deleuze. Like, this shit's difficult, and it's going to be difficult. join Friday. We'll go through it, and I'm going to be streaming later tonight as well, because there's a whole bunch of nightmares happening in America. So I'll be watching for that. Thank you very much. If you appreciate what we do, join the Discord, discord.gg/DGQC.
Looking forward to
please.
tonight.
Yes, that should be fun. But Jack, thanks for joining. It's a rare treat, but I appreciate it a great deal. Thank you.
Likewise, buddy.
And otherwise, thank everyone, YouTube. Thank you for all the supers. Thank you for everything. We'll get moving, and we'll see you all later tonight.